"It's time to go," my grandmother said. "Our work is done." She got down off her chair and picked up her handbag and slung it over her arm. She had me in her right hand and Bruno in her left. "Bruno," she said, "the time has come to restore you to the famous bosom of your family." "My mum's not very crazy about mice," Bruno said. "So I've noticed," my grandmother said. "She'll just have to get used to you, won't she?" It wasn't difficult to find Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. You could hear Mrs. Jenkins's shrill voice all over the room. "Herbert!" it was screaming. "Herbert, get me out of here! There's mice everywhere! They'll go up my skirts!" She had her arms high up around her husband, and from where I was, she seemed to be swinging from his neck. My grandmother advanced upon them and thrust Bruno into Mr. Jenkins's hand. "Here's your little boy," she said. "He needs to go on a diet." "Aye, Dad," Bruno said. "Aye, Mum." Mrs. Jenkins screamed even louder. My grandmother, with me in her hand, turned and marched out of the room. She went straight across the hotel lobby and out through the front entrance into the open air. Outside it was a lovely warm evening, and I could hear the waves breaking on the beach just across the road from the hotel. "Is there a taxi here?" my grandmother said to the tall doorman in his green uniform. "Certainly, madam," he said, and he put 2 fingers into his mouth and blew a long, shrill whistle. I watched him with envy. For weeks I'd been trying to whistle like that, but I hadn't succeeded once. Now I never would. The taxi came. The driver was an oldish man with a thick, black, drooping moustache. The moustache hung over his mouth like the roots of some plant. "Where to, madam?" he asked. Suddenly he caught sight of me, a little mouse, nestling in my grandmother's hand. "Blimey," he said. "What's that?" "It's my grandson," my grandmother said. "Drive us to the station, please." "I always liked mice," the old taxi driver said. "I used to keep hundreds of them when I was a boy." "Mice is the fastest breeders in the world. Did you know that, ma'am? So, if he's your grandson, then I reckon you'll be having a few great-grandsons to go with him in a couple of weeks' time." "Drive us to the station, please," my grandmother said, looking prim. "Yes, mum," he said, "right away." My grandmother got into the back of the taxi and sat down and put me on her lap. "Are we going home?" I asked her. "Yes," she said, "back to Norway." "Hooray!" I cried. "Oh, hooray, hooray, hooray!" "I thought you'd like that," she said. "But what about our luggage?" "Who cares about luggage?" she said. The taxi was driving through the streets of Bournemouth, and this was the time of day when the pavements were crowded with holiday-makers, all wandering about aimlessly with nothing to do. "How are you feeling, my darling?" my grandmother said. "Fine," I said. "Quite marvellous." She began stroking the fur on the back of my neck with one finger. "We have accomplished great feats today," she said. "It's been terrific," I said. "Absolutely terrific."